Hello, friends and listeners. I hope you are all doing well. Before we proceed, please help this channel grow by liking, subscribing, and commenting where you're tuning in from. If you're ready, let's begin the story. I never thought the day I gave birth would start like this. It was a cold silence, blinding white fluorescent lights, and long hospital corridors that seemed to hide a secret they didn't want me to know. Richard was pushing my wheelchair in a rush, not out of a frantic desire to keep me safe, but as if he couldn't wait to pass me off into someone else's hands. Mildred, my mother-in-law, walked a few paces ahead, waving her hand fan and muttering with clear annoyance. "Next time, don't be so picky. This place is fine. You're just a registered nurse, Claire. What do you actually know about high-end hospitals?" I clenched my fists. A contraction ripped through my abdomen, radiating deep into my bones. But her words hurt just as much. I was used to being belittled by her. But today, something felt different. There was something deeply unsettling about the way they were treating me this morning. This hospital was far too quiet for a maternity ward. The paint on the walls was peeling. The equipment looked like it belonged in the 1990s. The nurses walked around, unsmiling their eyes, completely disinterested. Even the standard smell of antiseptic was faint, overpowered by a damp, musty odor that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to ask a question, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Why aren't we at the medical center we toured last week?" Richard answered without any emotion, not even looking at me. "This is closer to Mom's house. It saves time and it's in network. You overcomplicate things, Claire." "Exactly." Mildred snapped quickly. "Stop making a fuss. Your husband's family knows what's best." Best for who? I almost said it out loud, but another contraction stole the breath from my lungs. When we reached the delivery room, a nurse took my prenatal paperwork. She barely glanced at it before giving a subtle nod to someone standing behind me, a silent communication I wasn't meant to catch. A quick dart of the eyes, a brief whisper that sounded like a code. My heart began to beat abnormally fast. They transferred me to the delivery bed. The surgical light was pointed directly at my face, making me feel exposed to an unfriendly clinical scrutiny. I was shivering not from the chill of the room, but from a dark premonition eating away at my chest. Richard and Mildred stood by the door for a moment. Richard patted my shoulder, but his eyes looked wrong. He wasn't worried. He wasn't nervous. He looked relieved. Mildred whispered to the attending nurse. It was faint, but I heard it. "Later, just follow the written orders, so this goes fast." "What written orders? Whose orders?" Before I could ask, the door clicked shut. They left me alone with a few nurses and a female doctor I had never seen before in my life. The doctor approached. Her ID badge hung on her white coat, Dr. Jasmine Sterling. Her voice was low, but her eyes were sharp, too sharp for a doctor meeting a patient for the first time. "Mrs. Claire Reynolds," she said gently. I nodded, forcing a strained smile. Dr. Sterling stared at the medical file the nurse handed her. She read a few pages, then stopped. Her brow furrowed slightly. Her lips pressed into a tight line. She flipped to another page, scanning it quickly. Her face changed. She didn't pale out of a lack of professionalism. She paled because she found something that absolutely should not have been there. She looked up, meeting my eyes directly. And for the first time since I stepped foot in this rundown facility, someone showed genuine fear. Fear for me. "Mrs. Reynolds," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Who brought you here, my husband?" "And my mother-in-law," I answered, gasping as another wave of pain hit. She took a deep breath. Then, without any dramatic movements, without raising her voice, she slipped her personal cell phone into my trembling hand. The screen was already glowing on the emergency dial pad. "Please, call 911 right now." "Speak softly," she instructed, her voice, a ghost of a whisper. I felt my heart stop. "What's wrong, doctor?" Her gaze was locked onto my face. "Don't make it obvious. Don't panic. But your husband and your mother-in-law didn't bring you here to support you. There are medication orders in here. Extra directives that were not written by your primary OB/GYN. My chest tightened. My whole body shook, and it had nothing to do with labor. "What do you mean?" I rasped. Dr. Sterling glanced at the door, her jaw tense. "The orders written here, if I administer them to you, they will crash your blood pressure in a highly abnormal way. And this specific clinic has a history of maternal complications that they easily brush off as natural." I couldn't breathe. The white light above me seemed to burn hotter. The beeping of the heart monitor sped up, almost deafening. "Doctor." Sterling leaned in closer, her voice a mix of tension and pity. "Mrs. Reynolds, I suspect they are planning something terrible. Don't let them know you know. My hand gripping the doctor's phone was shaking violently. I slowly drew in a breath and pressed the numbers 911 using fingers I could barely control. When the call connected, the voice of the emergency dispatcher echoed faintly against my ear. I opened my mouth to speak, but before a word could come out the door, the room creaked open slightly. Mildred's shadow fell across the crack. She was peeking in her face, dark, her eyes searching. I froze. "Doctor." Sterling moved swiftly, grabbing the privacy curtain and yanking it so the light cast only my silhouette toward the door. She stood tall, effectively blocking my body from view. "State your name and the hospital's location right now," Dr. Sterling whispered urgently. I heard the dispatcher's voice. 911, what is your emergency? "Ma'am, can you speak?" I swallowed the terror rising in my throat. Amidst the blinding pain, the harsh lights, and my irregular breathing, I forced myself to speak softly. "My name is Claire Reynolds. I'm at the Oak Creek Community Clinic." From the hallway, I heard Mildred's muffled voice. "Has it started? I hope they just speed up the process." I closed my eyes, gripping the phone tighter. My heart monitor chirped even faster. I didn't know if it was the contractions or the realization that there was something far more terrifying than the pain of childbirth, the distinct possibility that I wasn't meant to leave this hospital alive. Before I could think any further, the door moved again. A shadow stepped inside. The air grew heavy. I held my breath. The world around the delivery bed felt like it was suspended in the terrifying space between my life and someone else's plan for my death. I don't remember how I survived the first few minutes after that 911 call. My voice was shaking. I was short of breath, and the labor pains felt like they were splitting me in two. But Dr. Sterling's words echoing in my mind were more agonizing than physical pain. "They are planning something, and they've prepared it all in these papers." That medical file? The one that was supposed to contain standard labor protocols. It held something that made even an experienced doctor turn pale. A nurse walked over and checked my IV drip. She didn't even look at my face. Her eyes were blank. She finished her task too quickly and walked away without a word. It felt like my presence to her wasn't that of an expecting mother, but just an object being processed on an assembly line. Dr. Sterling waited for the door to close completely before taking a deep breath and turning back to me. She stood near my head. "I'm going to explain this quickly, but please, you must remain calm. They might be watching from the hallway," she murmured. I nodded, even though every nerve in my body screamed in panic. She held up the blue folder, resting it near the monitor. "This is not a standard chart. There are 3 glaring anomalies." She pointed to the first page. First, there's an order for a massive dose of a specific medication that is entirely inappropriate for your current condition. If combined with the IV fluid they just hung, it would cause your blood pressure to plummet instantly. I felt a cold sweat break out across my spine. "Who wrote that order?" I whispered. Dr. Sterling shook her head. "The signature is illegible, but it wasn't your primary care doctor, and it certainly wasn't me." She flipped to the next page. "Second, there's an addendum indicating you consented to this. Look at the signature." She showed me a consent form. The signature on the dotted line resembled mine, but it wasn't my handwriting. The strokes were too stiff, lacking the natural curves I always made. Someone had forged it using a sample. My throat felt like sandpaper. Someone forged my signature. I croaked, barely finding my voice. Dr. Sterling nodded slowly, her eyes full of caution. "Yes. And here is the third thing." She revealed a yellow form I had never seen before. "This is a high-risk declaration. Your pregnancy has been completely normal and stable. But this document claims you have a pre-existing condition that makes you prone to severe sudden complications." My eyes widened. Reflexively, I tried to sit up, but a sharp spike of pain forced me back down against the pillows. Who is trying to make it look like I'm high risk, doctor?" Sterling looked at me with deep gravity. "Forms like this are planted to create an airtight alibi, just in case something fatal happens on the table." The air in the room turned to ice. I squeezed my eyes shut, enduring a wave of physical agony that perfectly matched the psychological slap of the truth. Behind my eyelids, I didn't see hospital walls. I saw Richard and Mildred's faces from this morning. Their words, their actions, their sideways glances, they weren't the behaviors of worried family members. They were the behaviors of people waiting for a scheduled event. Flashback hours before we arrived, Richard rushed me out of the house without a word of comfort. He didn't check the hospital bag. He didn't secure the car seat. When I was crying in pain in the passenger seat, he was busy on his phone. His voice was low but urgent. "Just wait." "Yeah, according to the plan." I already told the guy there. When I asked who he was talking to, he ignored me. Mildred even mocked me for asking too many questions, letting one sentence slip from her mouth. Vague, but now crystal clear. After all this is done, our lives will finally be quiet. End of flashback. I slowly opened my eyes. The room felt suffocatingly small. Dr. Sterling checked the door again, making sure no one was eavesdropping. Mrs. Reynolds, I am not one to make wild accusations, but your medical file is a trap. It fits a familiar, terrifying pattern. What pattern, doctor? My voice broke. She leaned down. This specific clinic has had 2 maternal mortality cases recently. Both were written off as natural, tragic complications. But former staff members who quit anonymously reported that management pressured them to bypass autopsies. I swallowed hard. There was a bitter, metallic taste in my mouth. Do you understand what I'm telling you? She asked. I understood. I understood far too well. Before I could ask another question, the door cracked open. A nurse's voice drifted through the gap. Doctor, the patient's family wants an update. Can the husband come in now, doctor? Sterling didn't miss a beat. No. The patient is still in the observation stage. Keep the door closed. The nurse shut the door, but I could still hear Mildred's voice echoing from the corridor. Just tell me when it's ready. Just don't take too long. Dr. Sterling took a deep breath and focused entirely on me. Mrs. Reynolds, I need you to stay awake and I need you to stay strong. Do not show any change in your expression. Do not give them a single reason to suspect that we know. What are we doing, doctor? I asked. She looked at me with an expression that made the hairs on my arms stand up. We are going to find out exactly who wrote this lethal order and why your husband and mother-in-law were so desperate to bring you to this specific clinic. She paused, weighing the danger of her next words. Because if my suspicion is right, they aren't just hoping for a complication. My stomach plummeted. What do you mean? Dr. Sterling leaned in her voice an absolute whisper. Mrs. Reynolds, I don't think they have any intention of letting you leave this hospital alive. I gripped the bed rails. The heart monitor beeped erratically. Outside, Richard's footsteps approached. I heard him talking to someone in the hall. If things go south in there later, let's process the paperwork immediately. I held my breath. Dr. Sterling looked toward the door, her jaw tightening, then turned back to me, delivering the final shattering blow. The question isn't why they brought you here anymore. The question is what exactly they have prepared to do to you the moment I step away. And in that second, I realized childbirth wasn't the only thing waiting for me in this room. There was something much darker meticulously planned, and I was the target. It felt like the entire room tilted when the door finally closed again. Mildred's footsteps slowly faded down the hallway, but her words kept spiraling in my mind, striking my chest that was already brimming with pain and terror. If things go south in there later, let's process the paperwork immediately. As if my life was nothing more than an administrative hurdle. Another contraction hit, slamming me from the inside like a wave of fire, forcing my body to curl inward. I bit my lip until I tasted blood. I looked at Dr. Sterling. She was the only person in this building who looked at me like a human being, not a mark. She moved quickly to the head of the bed. Mrs. Reynolds, 911 dispatch needs more information. We need to call them back, she said, her tone focused. But this time be clearer. I'll stand here to block the window and the door. These nurses tend to barge in without knocking. I nodded, my whole body trembling. Her phone was already in my hand. The violent shaking from the contraction made my grip weak, but I managed to hit the callback button. The dispatcher answered immediately. 911. Emergency. Go ahead. I took a shaky breath. My name is Claire Reynolds. I am currently in labor at the Oak Creek Community Clinic. I have reason to believe my family is trying to have me killed. There was a 2-second silence. Just 2 seconds, but it was enough to make me panic that they thought I was delusional from the pain. Then the dispatcher's voice returned razor-sharp and alert. Mrs. Reynolds, is there an immediate active threat to your life in that room? I looked at Dr. Sterling. She nodded, giving me a hand signal to tell them everything. I saw medication orders in my chart that aren't normal, I whispered frantically. My signature was forged. The doctor in the room with me says my file was set up to cover up a fatality. The dispatcher's voice grew tense. Is the attending physician with you right now? Does she corroborate this? Dr. Sterling carefully took the phone, leaning her body so our shadows wouldn't be visible from the hallway. This is Dr. Jasmine Sterling. I am the attending physician. There is clear evidence of medical chart manipulation that is highly suspicious and would be lethal to the patient. Understood. Doctor. We are dispatching undercover units right now. They will pose as visitors and medical equipment technicians. Doctor, Can you keep the patient secure until they make contact? I can, Dr. Sterling replied firmly. She handed the phone back to me. The dispatcher spoke to me again. Mrs. Reynolds are your husband and mother-in-law, still on the premises. Yes, I gasped as a spike of pain ripped through me. They're in the waiting area. I heard them talking about insurance. They didn't want me to go to our real hospital. Another brief silence. Then the dispatcher spoke in a calm, highly controlled tone. We are classifying this as an active, covert, attempted homicide. Keep this line open if you can. If you have to hang up, we will route communications to your doctor's phone. I squeezed my eyes shut, fighting back the tears burning behind my eyelids. Dr. Sterling gently took her phone back and slipped it into her pocket. You did incredibly well, she whispered. Now we have to act completely normal. We can't let them know the script has flipped. I didn't feel incredible. I felt broken, shattered. The world I had built, my family, my home, my husband, was just a paper-thin facade easily torn apart. Suddenly, the door pushed open. A nurse appeared. Her face was blank, but her eyes held a dark, nervous energy. Doctor, the family is asking when they can see the patient. Doctor! Sterling smiled a perfectly professional, chillingly calm smile, though the muscles in her jaw ticked. Later, after the first stage of observation, please do not let anyone in without my explicit authorization. The nurse gave me a lingering look before stepping back out. Once the door clicked shut, Dr. Sterling adjusted the privacy curtain and leaned close. Listen to me, she murmured. The police have plainclothes officers arriving now. 2 will act like family members for another patient. 1 is posing as an HVAC technician. They are going to secure the hallway and the registration desk. Meanwhile, we proceed with our plan. Plan? I asked weakly. To keep you alive, she said, pointing to my IV bag. I swapped out the fluids when the nurse wasn't looking, but the lethal drug written in their forged chart will be requested soon. I have to make sure it never gets anywhere near your veins. Fear crawled up my throat. What exactly does that drug do? Dr. Sterling hesitated for a fraction of a second. If pushed via IV during active labor, it will cause catastrophic hypotension. Your blood pressure drops to 0. Your heart stops. I fell utterly silent. Everything felt freezing cold and burning hot at the same time. Footsteps echoed in the hallway again. Richard's footsteps. He wasn't frantic. He wasn't pacing like a nervous father. He was walking casually like a man waiting for an investment to mature. Then I heard his muffled voice speaking to someone, probably the nurse from earlier. If her vitals crash later, just document it as an amniotic fluid embolism. Let's keep this clean. My entire body convulsed with chills. The hospital blanket wasn't nearly enough to warm me. Dr. Sterling looked down at me, her eyes burning with intense pressure and fierce determination. Mrs. Reynolds, the police are moving into position. But before they can intervene, you have to get through this delivery. We have no choice but to push forward. Another contraction hit. This time, it was a tidal wave. I grabbed the metal bed rails, biting back a scream as the agony tore through my core. Dr. Sterling still had the 911 line open on an earpiece. She nodded slightly. They're in the building, she whispered to me. Hold on just a little longer. We're not leaving you. I looked up at her. Mrs. Reynolds, she said, her voice steady as bedrock. It's time to deliver this baby. And no matter what happens, do not lose consciousness. The nurses re-entered the room to prep the instruments. The surgical lights were adjusted. The monitors beeped in a frantic rhythm. The medical choreography around me felt like a dark ritual I wasn't supposed to survive. And just before they locked the door for delivery, I heard Mildred's voice drift in from the hall, a sentence that turned my blood to ice. Even if she survives the delivery, we can fix the chart in the ICU. My chest seized. I knew whatever started today wouldn't end in this room. I clutched my pregnant belly, gasping for air. As a single thought anchored my mind, they didn't expect me to live long enough to hear all of this. This chapter didn't close with the shutting of the delivery room door. It began the moment I realized I wasn't just giving birth to a child. I was giving birth to the truth that was going to destroy them all. Once the delivery room doors were sealed, the atmosphere shifted completely. The lighting felt sharper, the air heavier. The nurses moved quickly, but not with the efficiency of seasoned professionals. Their movements were rigid, rushed as if they were following a timeline dictated by someone other than the doctor. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw one of the nurses glance at the chart and whisper to her colleague, "Where's the push order? The one from earlier?" My heart hammered against my ribs. The push order. The lethal medication Dr. Sterling warned me about. Dr. Sterling stepped out from behind the sterile drape. Her face was perfectly composed, but her eyes were lethal. "I'll take the chart," she said in a tone that brokered zero argument. "I am the attending on this patient. No one pushes any meds, no one adjusts any drips without my direct verbal command. Am I clear?" The nurse looked annoyed, but she took a step back. Another massive contraction tore through me. My body went completely rigid. I gripped the sides of the bed, my palms slick with cold sweat. "Breathe, Mrs. Reynolds, doctor." Sterling commanded sharply, moving into position. "We're going to do this fast and safe." I nodded, trying to follow the breathing rhythm she was demonstrating, but my heart was racing too fast. Outside, muffled voices drifted through the heavy doors. A soft laugh. A laugh that had no business being outside a delivery room. Then Mildred's voice slipping through the crack. "Hope it goes according to plan." My core temperature seemed to plummet. Dr. Sterling caught my eye. She heard it too. Another nurse walked in, carrying a tray of instruments. She quickly checked a small slip of paper tucked under the main file, then stared at me. Her gaze made my skin crawl. It was the look you give a doomed animal, not a human being. But before she could reach for an IV syringe, Dr. Sterling snapped her fingers. "I need you two to fetch a new fetal monitor. This one's telemetry is lagging. Go. Now. The rest of you stay put." Her authoritative bark froze the room. The two sketchy nurses hesitated, then left. As soon as the door clicked shut, Dr. Sterling grabbed my wrist. "The undercover officers are in the hallway," she whispered rapidly. "They planted microtransmitters near the waiting room and behind the water cooler. Every word your family and those nurses are saying is being recorded to a secure server." I gasped, fighting through the labor pain. "Did they hear Mildred?" "Yes," Dr. Sterling's eyes were hard. "And your husband." My chest constricted so tightly the monitor alarmed. "What did he say?" Dr. Sterling didn't answer immediately. She checked the door, leaned down, and spoke directly into my ear. "An hour ago, Richard spoke to the charge nurse. He asked, 'How fast does a life insurance payout process if the maternal death involves malpractice?'" I stopped feeling my body. A horrifying, hollow silence swallowed me whole. "He wants me dead," I sobbed, my voice cracking. Dr. Sterling looked at me with a suppressed empathy, trying to keep me grounded. I wouldn't phrase it that way to a jury just yet, but their conversations are absolutely not those of a family hoping for survival. A searing, blinding pain suddenly erupted in my pelvis, stronger than anything before it. A primal scream ripped from my throat. I curled inward, clutching the sheets. "It's time, Dr. Sterling," said her voice shifting into pure medical command. "Mrs. Reynolds, focus on me. Focus on the breathing. Do not let your mind go dark. Your baby needs you awake." I tried. I forced my lungs to expand and contract. "The police will breach when the time is right," she continued calmly. "But right now, my job is to get this baby out alive. That is priority one." I nodded, tears streaming down my face. How did the man I slept next to every night become the man calculating my death? Footsteps approached the door again, Richard's voice impatient. "Is it happening? What protocol are they running? It needs to be fast." Then Mildred, her voice dripping like slow poison. "If we fail today, we're wasting time. Wasting time." Those words cut deeper than the contractions. Then another sound, a loud fake cough from the hallway. One of the undercover cops. Dr. Sterling glanced up, catching the signal. "They're in position," she murmured. The nurses returned, dragging the new monitor. As one of them passed my bed, she shot Dr. Sterling a panicked look. She knew something was off. "Mrs. Reynolds," Dr. Sterling announced loudly, her voice booming with authority. "On my count, give me everything you have." "Push." I nodded, my whole body vibrating. 1, 2. Deep breath. Push. The sound of the room faded, replaced by the chaotic screaming of the monitors and the rushing of blood in my ears. I pushed until I felt like my body was tearing apart. And then a cry. The sharp, piercing wail of a newborn shattering the sterile air. Like sunlight breaking through a black storm, my son was born. He was alive. His cry filled the room, bouncing off the walls and settling right into my trembling chest. I broke down in heavy, hysterical sobs. I felt like I had just heard the sound of life echoing back from the valley of death. Dr. Sterling carefully lifted my little boy. "It's a boy. Strong lungs." I covered my face with my hands. "Oh my God. Thank you. Thank you." But the pure joy lasted only a few seconds before it was stabbed by a voice from the hallway. A small, thin laugh. "Mildred. Hope the chart is updated." My chest tightened. The crying baby and doctor. Sterling's arms was the only proof I had survived a story someone else wrote to end with my murder. Dr. Sterling looked at me then at the door. Her jaw was clenched. "I'm afraid they aren't done," she mouthed. And in that moment, I realized surviving childbirth didn't mean I was safe. It just meant their initial plan had failed and they were about to panic and look for plan B. My baby was still crying. As the nurse cleaned his tiny body, his little shoulders, his flushed skin, his tiny fists clenched as if he was ready to fight from his first second on Earth, I cried out of relief, but also out of sheer terror. They didn't expect me to survive. They didn't expect us to survive. Dr. Sterling stood nearby, monitoring my vitals while keeping a hawk-like watch on the door. A few minutes passed. The door cracked open. A nurse walked in carrying a swaddle blanket, but her face didn't hold the joy of new life. It held a suppressed, frantic panic. She shot me a look, then hurried over to whisper to Dr. Sterling. "Mildred is very unhappy," she said. This wasn't the expected outcome. Not the expected outcome. The words felt like physical blows. Dr. Sterling gave a slight nod, replying in a chillingly calm tone. "Let them talk. Do not give them access to this room until I say so." The nurse hurried out. But before the door clicked shut, Mildred's voice bled through, trembling with rage. "Why is she alive? Why didn't her blood pressure drop? What the hell kind of protocol is that doctor running?" It hit me right in the gut. For the first time since walking into this clinic, the mask was entirely off. My survival was a failure to her. Dr. Sterling leaned down. "Did you hear that?" I nodded weakly, fresh tears falling. "Yes. Good." I stared at her, shocked. "We need audio evidence exactly like that," Dr. Sterling whispered. The detective's recording devices in the hall picked up every single syllable. I covered my mouth with a shaking hand. It wasn't just the shock. It was the realization that they were digging their own graves with their own voices. The door pushed open again. Richard walked in. He wore a forced plastic smile, a smile so entirely out of place it was terrifying. His eyes didn't drop to the baby. They didn't soften when he looked at me. They were completely blank, hiding a churning disappointment underneath. He stood by the bed, staring at my swaddled son. "Congrats. You made it," he said, completely devoid of emotion. "You made it." It sounded like a threat. I looked up at him. In that brief silence, the horrifying truth cemented itself in my mind. Richard didn't look like a proud, relieved father. He looked like a contractor staring at a botched demolition job. He stared at me for a long time before dropping his voice to a whisper. "You're tougher than I thought. Earlier, I thought you weren't gonna." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. "I thought you weren't gonna make it." Before I could speak, he turned on his heel. "I'm going to step out. I have a lot of paperwork to sort out." "Paperwork? What paperwork?" Dr. Sterling watched him leave her face hard as stone. "He's frustrated," she whispered to me. "Which means they're going to pivot to their backup plan. Not now, but soon." My pulse skyrocketed. Heavy footsteps approached from the hall. Mildred was frantic. "What does that mean? She's alive. Where is the altered chart? I told you to use those orders. If we don't, what was this all for?" I was suffocating on the fear. What was this all for? This wasn't just a toxic mother-in-law. This was a calculated hit. Dr. Sterling held up a finger, signaling me to stay quiet. She marched to the door and yanked it open. "Excuse me, Mrs. Reynolds. The patient requires absolute quiet. Wait in the lobby." "Doctor, we need to talk," Mildred hissed, her eyes darting past. "Doctor!" Sterling to glare at me. What exactly happened in there? The procedure didn't follow the file. Dr. Sterling didn't flinch. Patient care is my sole responsibility. And the file you are referring to contained severe, lethal irregularities that violated basic medical standards. Mildred's face turned beet red. "Those charts were prepared. You were supposed to follow them. Why did you change it?" "Because following them would have killed my patient," Dr. Sterling fired back flawlessly. Silence. A heavy, damning silence. Then Mildred gritted her teeth. "If you don't use those charts, how are we supposed to explain it to the insurance if a sudden complication arises tonight, doctor?" Sterling slammed the door right in her face. She marched back to my bed. "They aren't done, but we are one step ahead." I tried to sit up my muscles, screaming. "What do you mean?" Dr. Sterling pulled a small flash drive from her lab coat pocket. I managed to rip the computer logs. "A nurse attempted to alter your digital vitals while you were pushing. The detectives already have the mirror copy." I stared at the flash drive like it was a holy relic. Suddenly, Mildred's voice echoed through the door again, lower this time, darker. "If the first wave failed, initiate the secondary plan." I froze. Dr. Sterling froze. Secondary plan. My newborn let out a soft cry, the sound amplifying the sheer terror in the room. Dr. Sterling gripped my arm. "Stay calm. We won't let them near you." The police will breach the room when I give the signal. But despite her fierce determination, I knew the terrifying reality they had a plan B, and I was still trapped in the crosshairs. I was just trying to soothe Aaron when the door creaked open. It wasn't a standard hospital knock. It was a hesitant, guilty movement. The sketchy nurse from earlier slipped in. Her face was tight. She was carrying a clipboard and a clinical tablet. She walked toward the bedside table, intentionally avoiding my eyes. Dr. Sterling, who was checking my blood pressure cuff, immediately turned. "Can I help you?" Dr. Sterling asked, voice deadpan. The nurse stammered. Administration asked me to update Mrs. Reynolds' medical records. Orders from the top." "What orders?" Dr. Sterling stepped closer. The nurse blinked rapidly. "Just establishing the chronological timeline of the birth. There's a slight correction needed in the complications section." "What complications?" Dr. Sterling's voice dropped an octave. "Ice cold." The nurse glanced at the door, making sure no one was looking. "We need to log that the patient suffered a temporary loss of consciousness and a severe hypotensive crash during delivery, so that, if anyone asks later, the data supports it." I clutched my baby to my chest to make sure he was real. "Did I look like I lost consciousness?" I croaked, my voice shaking with rage. The nurse went dead silent. She knew the answer. "No." Dr. Sterling took a sharp breath and spoke with absolute authority. "I am the attending physician. I did not record a single second of lost consciousness." "Why are you falsifying data without my authorization?" The nurse began to shake. "I'm just following orders." "Whose orders?" Dr. Sterling demanded. The nurse swallowed hard. From Mrs. Mildred Reynolds and her son. They said the previous doctor already signed off on the high-risk addendums. "I'm just a tech doc. I just follow the screen." I clamped a hand over my mouth. The shock hit me like a freight train. My husband, my mother-in-law, they ordered hospital staff to alter my records to make it look like I almost died on the table. Why? So that if they successfully killed me tonight, it would look like a tragic continuation of a birth complication. Dr. Sterling stepped in front of the nurse, blocking her path to the door. "Unlock that tablet. Show me exactly what you altered." The nurse hesitated. "Doc, if I open this, I'll get fired." "You're going to face a lot worse than getting fired," a deep male voice interrupted. We all whipped around. The HVAC technician, who had been pretending to check the vents, walked in. His ID badge hung loosely, but his posture belonged to law enforcement. "We already pulled the server logs showing you accessing the system without physician approval," the undercover detective said, his voice smooth but authoritative. "It's in your best interest to cooperate, unless you want to go down as an accessory to conspiracy to commit murder." The nurse went completely white. "I didn't know. They just gave me the orders. We know," the detective said quietly, closing the door and locking it. "Which is why we need your testimony right now." The nurse gave up. Her hands trembling, she unlocked the tablet and pulled up the audit trail. Addendum: patient experienced sudden syncope. Correction administered 4 push of lethal BP med at 10:14 a.m. A drug Dr. Sterling never gave me. Falsified vitals. Sudden hypotensive crash, fluid volume altered. I held my breath, my fingers digging into the blanket. All of this. To build an alibi, I whispered, my voice breaking. "If I suddenly coded tonight in the ICU?" The nurse broke down sobbing. "Ma'am, I swear. They told me you were high risk from day one. They showed me the consent forms. The signature was already there. I thought it was real. It was a forged signature." Dr. Sterling snapped. The nurse buried her face in her hands. "I didn't know, Doc. I swear to God." The detective nodded. "You're going to be our star witness today. We're documenting this." Dr. Sterling took the tablet, locked the screen, and handed it to the detective. "Exhibit A. Keep it secure." The detective slid it into an evidence bag. The nurse backed against the wall, hyperventilating. "Doc, please. I just did what I was told. I didn't know they were trying to." Dr. Sterling ignored her, returning to my side to check my pulse. She tried to calm me, but I could see the furious fire burning in her own eyes. "We need to move fast," she whispered to me. "They're panicking because the first attempt failed." I stroked my baby's head, desperate for an anchor. "What did Richard say earlier?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Dr. Sterling took a deep breath. "After they moved you here, he spoke to his accomplice again. The police caught it on tape. He said, 'If the medical route fails, we have other options. The only thing that matters is the life insurance payout.'" I went completely rigid. My lips trembled. "Life insurance," I whispered. That's what this was about. Not just that, Dr. Sterling looked at me with grave intensity. "They're targeting the assets you've been secretly paying for. his mother's mortgage, his secret credit card debt, everything you've been carrying. I felt dizzy, as if my body couldn't physically hold the weight of the betrayal. This was why I held back my tears. To them, I wasn't a wife or a mother. I was a walking ATM worth more dead than alive. Dr. Sterling nodded slowly, full of empathy. But remember, you are safe. Your baby is safe. And right now the walls are closing in on them. Suddenly, Mildred's voice echoed loudly from the hallway, freezing the blood in my veins. Richard, is the digital chart updated yet? Because if it isn't, the life insurance adjusters are going to flag the claim. My voice caught in my throat. Dr. Sterling stood up straight, her eyes narrowing. The police have enough. The undercover detective pulled a two-way radio from his tool belt. He pressed the mic, whispering, "Unit 2, subjects are agitated and openly discussing motive. Prepare to move." My chest tightened. Aaron shifted slightly in my arms, as if he could feel the electricity in the room. Dr. Sterling leaned down. "They don't just want the money, Claire. They want to erase the only person who holds the financial power over them. They want 0 loose ends." I wiped a tear from my cheek. I had to be strong for my son. Dr. Sterling smiled faintly. "Exactly, and for justice." But before I could catch my breath, Richard's voice pierced the door louder and more aggressive. "If she hasn't changed it, I'm going in there to do it myself." The door handle rattled violently. Someone was throwing their weight against it. Dr. Sterling instantly stepped between the door and my bed, acting as a human shield. The detective grabbed the deadbolt from the inside, holding it firm. "Unit 3 ready. Primary subject attempting to breach patient room." And in that moment, I realized a new chapter was starting. That locked door was the only thin line separating my survival from the people who wanted me erased from the earth. The room fell into an eerie silence after the undercover detective braced the door, forcing Richard to back off with a stern warning that the patient was strictly off-limits during vitals checks. But it wasn't a comforting silence. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet right before a tornado touches down. I held my baby tighter. He was sleeping peacefully against my chest. His warmth was the only thing reminding me I was still alive, even while the hands that swore to protect me were actively trying to steal my life away. "Doctor." Sterling stood beside me holding a different blue folder. It contained photocopies of documents she had managed to secure before the nurse tried to overwrite the system. "I spoke with the lead detective," she whispered. "Before we initiate the final takedown, they want you to see this." "What is it?" I asked, though a part of me wanted to cover my ears and scream. "Your insurance policies and financial statements." She opened the first page. It was a standard life insurance policy I had taken out years ago, back when I thought my life was normal and safe. But on the second page, my eyes landed on something that made my mouth go entirely dry. Date of beneficiary change 2 months ago. With shaking eyes, I read the name in the primary beneficiary column. It wasn't my estate. It wasn't my siblings. Richard Reynolds. 100%. My chest caved in. I couldn't catch my breath. "I didn't authorize this. I swear." Dr. Sterling gently patted my hand. "The police know. Their fraud division already confirmed the signature is a forgery." I stared at the ink. It looked like my signature, but the loops were stiff. It was traced. Someone had stared at my driver's license for hours to get it right. "Richard!" I gasped. "He forged it." "Not just him, doctor." Sterling replied, her voice simmering with restrained anger. "The detectives pulled the insurance broker's security footage. Mildred is the one who went into the office. 2 weeks later, she mailed in a photocopy of your ID along with the forged change of beneficiary form. I never gave them my ID, which is why the DA is going to have a field day with this." I felt my skin burn. The wound in my soul was being ripped wide open, exposing a reality far more horrific than simple infidelity or a bad marriage. They didn't just hate me. They had meticulously calculated my net worth upon my death. Next, Dr. Sterling opened a stack of bank statements the police had subpoenaed. This is the second part. A list of transactions glared back at me. Small transfers to Richard's private checking account. Mortgage payments to Mildred's house paid from an account I funded. Massive credit card payments for debts Richard never told me he had. And then the red flag, a massive withdrawal from my emergency savings account just 2 weeks before my due date. What? I couldn't finish. "There is digital evidence showing Richard tried to wire the bulk of your savings to an offshore holding account," Dr. Sterling whispered. "He probably assumed you'd be too exhausted with the 3rd trimester to notice." I felt nauseous. I wanted to scream, to throw the papers across the room. It was an ultimate betrayal. "Think back." Dr. Sterling probed gently. Did your husband ask you to sign any random paperwork recently? Maybe saying it was for an insurance renewal? My eyes widened. The memory hit me like a physical punch. Richard coming home from work tossing 2 papers on the kitchen counter. Just a standard policy renewal, babe. Sign here. You know how annoying these brokers are. I signed it blindly because he was my husband. I trusted him. Dr. Sterling sighed heavily. It wasn't a renewal, Claire. It was a power of attorney waiver, allowing his mother to act as a proxy for the beneficiary change. All the air left the room. Oh my God, my voice cracked. He's been planning this for months. Dr. Sterling nodded slowly. Yes. A soft knock interrupted us. The detective walked back in. This time, his HVAC cover story was completely dropped. He looked entirely like a cop. Mrs. Reynolds, he said, crouching slightly to stay out of the door's window line. We're ready to move, but we need your consent on how to play this. I nodded, my hands trembling. We have enough probable cause for forgery, attempted medical manipulation, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder, the detective listed off. If you're strong enough, we want to bring you into the administration room. We're going to trap them with their own lies on the record. I looked down at Aaron. His soft cheeks, his steady breathing. I stroked his little head. I knew I wasn't going to run. I wasn't going to hide. I was done being the compliant, submissive wife. What do I need to do? I asked. The detective looked at me with deep respect. We're going to use everything we have to drop the floor out from under them all at once. I nodded slowly. For the first time since arriving at this nightmare of a hospital, I felt a fraction of control over my own destiny. And I knew that by the end of today, nothing would ever be the same. I had barely gathered my strength when a hospital administrator knocked and entered the room. He looked incredibly tense. Mrs. Reynolds Hospital Management is requesting your presence in the risk management mediation room. There are some procedural anomalies regarding your delivery that need to be addressed. I instantly knew this wasn't a standard meeting. The hospital was smelling the legal liability, and my in-laws were getting desperate. Dr. Sterling adjusted Aaron's blanket against my chest and gripped my shoulder. We're ready. The undercover detectives are already in the room, posing as hospital auditors and ethics committee members. Just sit there and listen. I nodded, my breathing heavy but steady. When they wheeled me into the large mediation room, it felt like a dark theatrical stage. Richard was already sitting there. His face was blank, but his eyes were darting nervously. Mildred sat next to him, clutching her purse tightly, glaring with suspicion. 2 hospital attorneys sat looking pale and sweaty. 3 hospital auditors who I knew were undercover cops sat quietly at the end of the long mahogany table. And there was an empty space in the middle for my wheelchair. I rolled in slowly, holding my baby. The room waited for me to speak, but I chose silence. Let them drown in their own panic. The hospital attorney cleared his throat to open the meeting. We have convened this meeting because our systems detected severe, highly irregular medical protocols attempted during Mrs. Reynolds' delivery. Mildred immediately interrupted, her voice shrill. Irregular. Where are you getting that? The only thing irregular is this doctor right here. She pointed a venomous finger at Dr. Sterling. She refused to follow the written charts. She refused to administer the prescribed medication. Dr. Sterling smiled a cold, calculated smile. Which charts are those, Mrs. Reynolds? The ones not signed by an attending physician or the ones where the patient's signature was forged? The room froze. Richard sat up straight. Doctor, do not accuse my family of crimes. That was a standard labor chart. Standard according to who interrupted one of the auditors, the undercover detective cutting Richard off completely. The second detective opened a thick black binder. Dr. Sterling reported a massive data discrepancy between the physical chart and the digital EMR system. We pulled the server logs. We have the exact nurse ID who attempted to alter the complications record. The nurse who had tried to fake the chart was sitting in the corner, looking nauseous. She had clearly already confessed to everything. Richard raised his voice, feigning outrage. This is impossible. It's a system error. The detective flipped to the first page. CCTV footage from hallway sector 4 shows you speaking to the charge nurse at 10:14 a.m. The detective pressed play on a small digital recorder on the table. Richard's voice filled the silent room. If her vitals crash later, just document it as an amniotic fluid embolism. Let's keep this clean. Richard's chair squeaked as he shifted desperately, trying to maintain composure. He looked at the hospital lawyers for help. They stared at the ceiling. The second recording played. Mildred's voice low and emphatic. Make sure the dose is high enough so her blood pressure drops on its own. I gripped Aaron's blanket. My body shook. I was hearing the exact words they used to orchestrate my murder. Doctor. Sterling sat perfectly still, her eyes like daggers. The hospital attorney swallowed hard. Mrs. Reynolds, Mr. Reynolds. Do you care to explain these statements? Mildred forced a laugh. That's taken out of context, I never meant. Mrs. Reynolds, the lead detective, cut in his tone, shifting from corporate to lethal. The parabolic microphones we used are FBI standard issue. They don't take things out of context. Richard finally snapped. He slammed his fist on the table. This wasn't a murder plot. We were just stressed. My wife is medically fragile. We were just worried. I have never been medically fragile a day in my life except for this morning when you forced me to come to this butchery of a clinic, I said, my voice quiet but cutting through the room like glass. All eyes turned to me. My voice trembled with rage and grief. And I heard exactly how you discussed what you were going to do with the money when I didn't survive. Richard pointed a shaking finger at me. Stop making wild accusations, Claire. The third undercover detective, who had been silent, pulled out a thick manila envelope. These are the life insurance documents, he said flatly, including the change of beneficiary form containing a signature that our forensic team has already confirmed is a forgery. Mildred gripped the armrests of her chair. No. The insurance broker made a mistake. The broker gave a sworn statement, the detective fired back. And we have 4K surveillance footage of you, Mildred, bringing in a photocopy of Claire's stolen ID. I swallowed a sob. Mildred, why? I whispered. Mildred didn't answer. She went completely rigid, her face contorted with a mix of fury and terror. Richard tried to stand up and slam the table again, but the lead detective stood up faster. Richard Reynolds, Mildred Reynolds, do not move from those chairs. We have active felony arrest warrants for both of you. Richard panicked, stumbling backward. I didn't do anything. This is a setup. The detective looked at him with zero emotion. Digital server logs, covert audio recordings, and forged financial documents don't set people up, Richard. Dr. Sterling finally spoke. Claire, do you have anything else to say to them? I looked at them, the two people I had called family, and for the first time I saw their true faces, the faces of monsters who valued a payout over a human life. My words came out slow, but crystal clear. I was the one you called a burden, but I was the one funding your entire lives, and now you get nothing. In the absolute silence that followed, Aaron let out a soft cry against my chest. It felt like the sound of an old world collapsing and a new one taking its very first breath. After that confrontation in the administration room, the following days felt like a hurricane that refused to dissipate. My voice was hoarse from crying through the night, but my footsteps were finally steady. I felt like I was walking out of a thick, toxic fog that I had mistakenly called a marriage. Richard and Mildred were denied bail, held in county lockup pending the investigation. The rundown clinic became an active crime scene. Servers were seized, physical charts were photographed, and every second of CCTV footage was confiscated. The news of the maternity ward murder for hire plot and the massive insurance fraud leaked to the local press. The police had me transferred to a VIP suite at a real highly secure hospital downtown. Not for luxury, but for my absolute protection. Months later, the trial began. The courtroom was packed with journalists as the true crime nature of the case had caught national attention. But for me, this courtroom was simply the final stage of closing the darkest chapter of my life. I sat at the prosecutor's table next to the district attorney. Aaron was safely in the care of a trusted court advocate in the back. Dr. Sterling sat in the row right behind me, a silent pillar of strength. The heavy wooden doors opened. Richard was let in wearing a bright orange county jail jumpsuit. He was pale, his hair messy, looking entirely defeated. Mildred followed her steps slow, refusing to make eye contact with anyone, clearly unable to accept that she was no longer the respected upper-middle-class matriarch she pretended to be. When my eyes met Richard's, I felt a chaotic mix of emotions. Sadness, anger, disgust, but above all, relief. Relief because they had absolutely zero power over me anymore. The judge called the court to order, and the charges were read into the record: attempted murder in the first-degree conspiracy, medical chart falsification, wire fraud, and insurance fraud. When the DA called the first witness, the nurse who altered the charts, the courtroom went dead silent. She was shaking on the stand, but her voice was clear. I was ordered by Mildred and Richard Reynolds to alter the data. I didn't know it was a lethal protocol at first. When I realized it, I was terrified. Richard scoffed loudly from the defense table. You're just trying to save your own skin. The defendant will remain silent, the judge barked, banging his gavel. Next, the audio recordings were played. If her vitals crash later, just document it as an amniotic fluid embolism. Make sure the dose is high enough so her blood pressure drops on its own. Gasps echoed through the gallery. Richard shook his head aggressively. That's not what I meant, we were just venting. The DA stared him down. You were venting while giving direct orders to clinical staff moments before a medical procedure. Mr. Reynolds, that's not a joke. Then came the insurance documents, the forged signatures, the timeline of the beneficiary change, the HD footage of Mildred walking into the broker's office. Mildred's face crumbled not out of remorse but out of pure public humiliation. The next witness was Dr. Sterling. She sat on the stand with absolute authority. Using precise medical terminology, she dismantled every irregularity in the file. The chart was engineered to create a perfect alibi for a maternal fatality. Had I administered the requested dosage of that medication, Claire Reynolds would have suffered immediate cardiac arrest. The courtroom felt as silent as a graveyard. Then it was my turn. I slowly took the stand. My legs were shaking, but my voice found a strength I had suppressed for years. Your Honor, I began looking directly at the judge. For years, I carried this family financially. I paid the mortgage on my mother-in-law's house. I quietly paid off my husband's secret credit card debts. I paid for Mildred's hypertension medication. I never complained once. My eyes burned, but no tears fell. But when it was time for me to give birth, they didn't bring me to our chosen hospital. They brought me to an underfunded, corrupt clinic, not to save money. They brought me to a place they thought they could control, a place where a maternal death could be swept under the rug as a natural tragedy. They tried to turn my body and the birth of my son into an ATM machine. I was not a perfect wife. But I did not deserve to be executed on a delivery table for a life insurance payout. The deliberations didn't take long. When the jury returned, the foreperson read the verdict. Guilty on all counts. Mildred shrieked in desperation as the judge denied any leniency. Richard tried to lunge toward the gallery, but two bailiffs slammed him back. Claire, you ruined this family, he screamed. I looked at him completely unfazed. You ruined yourselves. The family court rulings followed swiftly. I was granted full unshared custody of Aaron. The divorce was finalized immediately. Every single asset in my name was returned to my sole control, and the house I was paying for was seized and sold to cover my legal fees. Richard and Mildred were served with permanent restraining orders. When the gavel finally banged, it sounded like the ringing bells of freedom. Walking out of the courthouse, the cool breeze hit my face. Aaron was asleep in his carrier. For the first time, in a very long time, I took a deep breath without feeling like someone was watching me, waiting for me to fail. I realized I was truly alive, and my survival was no longer in the hands of people who wished me harm. I felt reborn, but deep in my chest, I knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a life I was finally choosing for myself. A few months after the sentencing, my life no longer resembled the dark, terrifying corridors of that clinic. Slowly, like the sun rising after a brutal, endless night, everything began to take on a new shape. The clinic where I was almost murdered was shut down by the state. Management was gutted and several complicit staff members were indicted. One afternoon, Dr. Sterling visited my small sunlit rental house. The state investigations are officially closed, she said, sipping her coffee. And I have a proposition for you. I'll agree to anything as long as it doesn't involve me getting back on a delivery bed, I joked. She laughed. Better than that. I want to open a boutique clinic. Not a massive corporate hospital, not a shady backdoor facility, a dedicated women's and maternity clinic. A place that is absolutely safe. A place that will never, ever let what happened to you happen to anyone else. I looked down at Aaron playing on his playmat. If a place like that had existed, maybe I wouldn't have had to walk through hell. I nodded slowly. Let's do it. Reynolds Women's Clinic opened 8 months later. The walls were painted in warm, calming tones. There was no harsh smell of bleach, just clean air and lavender. We had a beautiful reading corner for expecting mothers. We used my maiden name, a name that was once belittled, now standing proudly on a brick facade. On opening day, local health advocates attended along with a man I vaguely recognized from the DA's office, Attorney Nathan Vance. He was the prosecutor who helped the detectives map out the complex wire fraud charges. He walked up to me after the ribbon cutting. Mrs. Reynolds, he said, shaking my hand warmly. I followed the fallout of your case. It is truly incredible to see you standing here today. I didn't think I'd be here either, I replied, with a genuine smile. If your clinic ever needs pro bono legal counsel for patients in domestic distress, I'm your guy, he offered politely. There was no hidden agenda, no aggressive charm, just respect. And that was more attractive and grounding than any grand promise my ex-husband had ever made. Later that evening, after the clinic closed, I sat on the front bench outside. Aaron was sleeping soundly against my chest. The evening breeze ruffled my hair, feeling like a gentle hand wiping away the last of my scars. Down the sidewalk, I saw a couple of young, expectant mothers looking at the clinic hours posted on the window, hope in their eyes. I smiled and gave them a small wave. I felt something bloom in my chest that I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. Pure, unadulterated freedom. I looked up at the clinic sign. My name, the name they tried to erase, was now a sanctuary for others. I hugged Aaron tighter. A long time ago, Mommy almost didn't make it off a table, I whispered to my son. But Mommy is standing right here, making sure no one else ever becomes a target. The sky painted itself in brilliant shades of orange and gold. And for the first time in my life, I felt that every breath I took belonged entirely to me. Not to an abusive husband. Not to a greedy mother-in-law. Not to anyone who thought they could dictate when I lived or died. This was my breath. This was my life. And I was finally living it for me. Celine Reynolds knew how to carry herself. It wasn't a skill you could just learn from a textbook. It was a trait forged through years of working in the financial control department of a massive Chicago-based trading corporation. In her world, numbers never lied. People, however, lied all the time. Now in her early 30s, Celine had short, dark hair and striking gray eyes that held a particular coolness. People often mistook it for disinterest until they engaged her in a serious conversation. Only then would they realize it wasn't apathy at all. It was the profound patience of someone who knew exactly how to wait for the right moment. She had spent 5 years buried in spreadsheets and financial reports. She could spot a discrepancy in a 100-page document in a matter of minutes and never once raised her voice in a meeting, even when her colleagues were spouting utter nonsense. Upper management valued her for her level head. Her husband, it seemed, did too. Lately, however, Celine had noticed that the word valued was slowly being replaced by the word used in her husband's mind, even if he hadn't admitted it out loud yet. They had been together for 7 years. The first 3 were wonderful. After that, things just felt like a habit. Then the habit started to drag. But Celine kept convincing herself it was just the stress of the grind. Anthony's business wasn't doing well, making him constantly on edge. It will pass, she thought. She was used to explaining away other people's flaws by blaming their circumstances. It was part of her nature and perhaps her greatest weakness. Anthony Reynolds was 7 years older than his wife. He owned a small chain of home goods stores, 4 branches scattered across different Chicago neighborhoods, a warehouse out in the suburbs, 2 hired managers, and a dozen retail employees. On the outside, he exuded confidence. He wore tailored suits, had a habit of talking about future plans as if they were already done deals, and possessed the ability to walk into any room as if he owned it. To outsiders, it was highly effective. But Celine knew what lay behind the curtain. The late-night conversations about mounting debts, the heavy silences after calls from the bank, the irritation he tried to mask with exhaustion. Still, knowing something didn't mean fully understanding it. The turning point began on a Tuesday morning with a text from her mother. Sophia had written late Monday night. "Honey, your dad and I decided to fly up for a few days. We miss you guys. Your dad says he hasn't been to the city in a long time and wants to walk around his old stomping grounds." Celine read the message twice, plugged her phone into charge, and stared at the ceiling of her bedroom where she had been sleeping alone for several nights. Anthony was away on a business trip. Her parents rarely visited. After her father retired, they sold their house in the suburbs and moved down to Florida, buying a small place near the Gulf Coast, a dream they'd held their whole lives. Her father, Robert, hated the hassle of flying, and her mother hated being a burden. If they had decided to come, it meant they were truly homesick. Or maybe they sensed something. Sophia had that strange maternal intuition that worked even across state lines and through radio silence. Celine had never complained to her parents about her relationship with Anthony. Not once in 7 years. It wasn't out of pride, but out of principle. Family matters stay inside the house. Now she was starting to think that principle had cost her too much. Anthony had left for his business trip, carrying a large duffel bag, looking every bit the busy entrepreneur. He said he was meeting suppliers a couple of states over to negotiate a new batch of inventory. Maybe 3 days, maybe a week, he had said. He kissed her on the cheek, a quick practiced motion, like turning a doorknob before walking out and getting into his Uber. Celine had watched from the window as the black car disappeared around the corner. She hadn't felt anything out of the ordinary. That in itself should have been a red flag, but she was used to chalking up her emotional numbness to sheer exhaustion. She texted her mother that she would pick them up herself. Their flight was landing at O'Hare International Airport at 6:00 p.m. She left work early, allowing plenty of time for Chicago rush hour traffic and parking. Terminal 3 at O'Hare was alive and chaotic at that hour. It smelled of roasted coffee from the nearby kiosks, buzzing with that inexplicable nervous energy, unique to places where people are simultaneously saying goodbye and reuniting. Celine grabbed a takeout coffee, stood near the glass doors of the arrivals area, and waited. The flight board showed the plane had landed. Within 20 minutes, passengers began pouring out. For the first few minutes, she simply watched the stream of people with their rolling luggage. Exhausted faces, joyful hugs, kids being hoisted into the air, elderly couples walking slowly and silently because they no longer needed words. She was looking for her mother, a petite, impeccably dressed woman in a beige coat, and her father, a tall, upright man with the distinct, unwavering posture of a former city official, a trait he hadn't lost even in retirement. But they weren't the first ones she saw. First, she recognized a familiar line of shoulders, then the characteristic turn of a head, and finally, the face. Anthony was standing off to the side of the arrivals hall, slightly removed from the main flow of foot traffic where it was less crowded. He wasn't looking around. He was looking at a young woman, standing right next to him. She had blonde hair, wore a cropped leather jacket, and had a travel tote slung over her shoulder. She was tall with that striking natural confidence of someone who is used to being looked at and enjoys it. Celine didn't know her. She had never seen her before in her life, but one glance was all it took. This woman was no colleague or business partner. The blonde woman said something to Anthony and laughed. Anthony leaned in, took her bag from her hand carefully, the way you take something from someone you desperately want to please, and kissed her. Not on the cheek, on the lips. It was brief, but there was no hesitation, no caution. It was the kiss of two people who belonged to each other. Celine didn't move. The coffee in her hand remained perfectly still. She stood frozen, watching her husband, the man supposedly out of state, negotiating with suppliers, take a strange woman's hand and lead her toward the exit doors. They walked side by side, shoulders brushing, and in their movements, there was a specific rhythm that doesn't form overnight. It was the synchronized walk of people intimately used to each other's presence. He was carrying her bag. It was such a small thing, but it was the detail that hurt the most. Anthony hadn't carried Celine's bags or done anything of the sort for her in a very long time. Something shifted deep in her chest. It wasn't immediate, sharp pain. It was a dull, almost physical shove. It felt as though the floor beneath her had violently tilted and then snapped back into place, but her internal balance was permanently altered. Celine took a step forward. In that exact second, a heavy, warm hand clamped down firmly on her shoulder. "Sweetheart." It was her father's voice. Calm, deep, stripped of any excessive emotion. She turned around. Robert Cruz was standing right beside her. He was a man in his late 60s with a straight back and a face that over decades of working in Chicago's City Hall had acquired a specific, unshakable composure that couldn't be bought or faked. He had seen everything. He understood everything. He had processed the situation before she even had, or at least at the exact same moment. She could feel it in the steady grip of his hand. Confident, devoid of trembling. The grip of a man who had just made an executive decision. Back in his day, Robert Cruz had overseen zoning land disputes and investment policies for the city. Hundreds of people with brilliant business plans and hidden agendas had passed through his office. He was an expert at reading a person from the very first conversation. 7 years ago, when Anthony Reynolds first came over to ask for his daughter's hand, Robert had stared at his future son-in-law for a long time without speaking. He hadn't objected, but he hadn't celebrated either. Celine had thought her father just didn't want to let his daughter go. Now she realized her father simply knew a lot more than he let on. Behind him stood her mother, Sophia, petite, wearing her signature beige. She looked exactly as Celine had pictured her, but she was looking at her daughter with a specific kind of worry, the kind mothers try to hide behind a faint smile but can never fully erase from their eyes. "Dad." Celine started to speak, but she didn't recognize her own voice. It was too weak, too fragile. "Sweetheart," her father repeated. And in that one word, everything was contained. The understanding, the shared pain he was actively suppressing, and something solid as steel, a decision made without a shadow of a doubt. "Let us teach him a lesson he will never ever forget." She looked back to where Anthony had been standing. He was already near the automatic doors, back straight, confident. The blonde woman was whispering something in his ear. He was smiling. They had passed within 30 feet of Celine, and he hadn't looked over his shoulder once. He hadn't felt a thing. He hadn't sensed his wife, his father-in-law, or his mother-in-law. None of the people whose sheer proximity should have set off alarms in his chest. That, perhaps, was the most agonizing realization of all. If you walk up to him right now, her father said, his voice a low, steady hum, he'll tell you she's just a colleague, a business meeting. He'll tell you you're crazy and making things up. You'll make a public scene. He'll turn it around, make you the hysterical wife, and he'll seize the narrative. Guys like him are masters at that. I've seen dozens of them in my career. They run on other people's emotional reactions. It's like fuel to them. Celine was silent. She watched the two figures blend into the crowd by the glass doors and disappear into the Chicago evening. We don't need a scandal, her father continued, speaking in an even tone as if explaining a basic matter of logistics. We need a precise strike, in the right place at the right time, with zero noise, Dad, Celine finally said. This time her voice was much steadier. You just got off a plane. Exactly, Robert replied curtly, taking her by the elbow. So let's find the car. Let's go home, have a good dinner, and then we are going to sit down and have a very calm, very serious talk. Sophia hugged her daughter silently. Not a desperate squeeze, just a long, grounding embrace. Celine didn't cry. Standing in the middle of the noisy O'Hare arrivals terminal, she felt something inside her slowly, coldly beginning to rearrange itself. It wasn't shattering. It was restructuring. Like a high-rise building being methodically dismantled floor by floor without a single explosive. They left through a different exit. Anthony and his companion were long gone. Celine didn't bother scanning the taxi line for them. She found her SUV in the parking garage, loaded her parents' suitcases into the trunk, and sat in the driver's seat for a few minutes. That corner of the garage was mostly empty, illuminated only by a flickering fluorescent light casting a sickly yellow glow. Did you know? Her mother asked gently from the back seat. No, Celine said. And it was the truth. There had been feelings, sure. The tone of the last few months had felt off. Too many, I'll be working late texts. The way he stopped talking about his business in detail and simultaneously stopped asking about her life. But she hadn't known. Because she hadn't wanted to know. That was another hard truth she allowed herself to accept for the very first time. It's good that you didn't know, her father said from the passenger seat. It means you haven't signed anything in a fit of emotion. Celine looked at him. What do you mean? We'll talk about it tomorrow. Right now, just drive. Nobody spoke on the ride home. Her father looked out the window as they merged onto the Kennedy Expressway, watching the city skyline approach. He hadn't been to Chicago in years, but he wasn't looking at it with nostalgia. He was surveying it with the calculating eyes of an auditor assessing a distressed asset. From the back, her mother rested a quiet hand on Celine's shoulder, tightening her grip slightly whenever the car took a sharp curve. Celine drove smoothly, stopping at every red light once they hit the city grid, marveling at how normal this day had started. Coffee, corporate emails, a grocery list, plans to make a pot roast for her dad. When they pulled into her building's parking garage, her phone buzzed. A text from Anthony. Hey, grabbing dinner with the partners. Morning meeting tomorrow. I'll call you after. Kiss. Celine read it. She slipped the phone into her purse, stepped out of the car, and popped the trunk. I've got it, her father said. Okay, she replied. Robert Cruz grabbed the two heavy suitcases and marched toward the elevator bank. Back straight steps measured. His expression was so completely unreadable that no one could have ever guessed that just an hour ago he had witnessed something that fundamentally altered his perception of his son-in-law from top to bottom. Anthony called on Wednesday night around 8:00 p.m. Celine had just finished clearing the dinner table. Her mother was washing dishes at the sink, while her father sat in the armchair by the floor-to-ceiling window, drinking coffee and reading something on his phone. When Anthony's name flashed on the screen, Celine froze for a fraction of a second. Then she picked it up and walked out into the hallway, closing the door softly behind her. She leaned against the wall and pressed the phone to her ear. Hey, Anthony said. He sounded tired, but like a man nobly enduring a heavy burden. How are things there? Fine, she answered evenly. How are the meetings suppliers are being difficult? Stalling. We can't agree on a price point. Probably going to take another day or two. I'm exhausted. He paused for a beat. Do you miss me? I'm managing, Celine said. Her voice wasn't any warmer or colder than it had been for the last few months. It was exactly how she had been speaking to him lately during that phase where nothing they said to each other constituted a real conversation, just an exchange of empty, formal phrases. She listened to his voice and realized how effortlessly he lied. No stuttering, no hesitation, no underlying tension. He sounded like a man who had been doing this for a very long time. He was completely used to it. All right, I'll call you tomorrow. Good night. Good night, she replied, and ended the call. She stood in the dim hallway, gripping her phone. He hadn't asked how her day was. He hadn't asked what she had for dinner or if anything interesting had happened. He hadn't asked a single thing. He had simply checked a box on his mental to-do list. Call the wife, close the tab. Celine slipped the phone into her pocket and walked back into the kitchen. Him? Her mother asked softly, not looking up from the soapy water. Him, Celine confirmed, grabbing a dish towel. Her father didn't ask anything. He had drawn his conclusions long ago. Sophia turned off the faucet and turned to look at her daughter. She looked at her for a long time without saying a word. Then she just hugged her. A short, tight, fiercely maternal embrace, and then she let go. Sometimes that's the only thing a mother can do, and exactly what is needed most. Celine didn't cry, not for the first time in these 2 days, and not because she didn't have a reason to, but because tears required a relinquishing of control and she wasn't ready to let go of her control just yet. Not now. She walked into the master bathroom and splashed cold water on her face. She stared at herself in the mirror. 34 years old. 7 of those years spent with a man who, as it turned out, she didn't know at all. Or perhaps she did know but had simply refused to put the puzzle pieces together because she was terrified of what the final picture would show. Water dripped from her chin. The woman in the mirror stared back with a piercing gaze and tightly pressed lips. She wasn't broken. She was gathering her strength. The next morning, Thursday before Celine got ready for work, her father asked her to sit down with him for a minute. Just the two of them were in the kitchen. Sophia hadn't come out of the guest room yet. Robert spoke evenly the way a person speaks about matters of great importance that require zero emotional interference. No preamble. "The condo is in your name," he began. "Yes," Celine said. "It was the smartest thing we ever did. Your gift. The deed was transferred to me. Sole ownership. Just me. Is Anthony's name on any paperwork related to the property? The title, a second mortgage, a power of attorney? No. His registered address is here, but he is not listed as an owner anywhere." Her father gave a short nod, like a man having a pre-existing theory confirmed. "Have you signed anything in the past year guarantees consent to mortgage powers of attorney joint loan applications?" Celine shook her head. He tried to push for it a few times, kept talking about refinancing his business, getting a joint loan. He said the terms would be better with dual incomes, that the banks would be more lenient. A few months ago, he even suggested taking out a HELOC on the condo, just as a technical step for a 2 or 3 month bridge loan. But I always put it off. I told him I wanted to understand the paperwork first, that I needed to consult an independent advisor. He'd get annoyed, but he never outright forced me. He held back. "Thank God you delayed," her father said, setting his coffee mug down on the granite counter. "This isn't just about sloppy family finances, Celine. This is a strategy, deliberate and calculated." Celine stared at him. "Are you sure?" "Not entirely, but I will be soon." He pulled out his phone. "I have an old colleague I've trusted for decades, David Lawson. He's a financial consultant. He understands corporate debt, credit risks, and bankruptcy mechanisms better than most bank analysts I dealt with at City Hall. I'm going to ask him to run a background check on your husband's business. Open source intelligence. Legally available corporate filings. Only what is out there for anyone paying attention." "Dad," Celine said softly, "you just got into town 2 days ago." "I did," he agreed without a trace of sarcasm, "but I haven't known you for only 2 days. And I haven't been observing that man for only 2 days either. Even from Florida, even without knowing the details, I've had time to think. Something about him rubbed me the wrong way from the very beginning. From the night he came over to introduce himself. I kept my mouth shut. I didn't want to interfere. Today, I'm wishing I had." Celine had no response. There was nothing to protest. It's pointless to argue with your own past. David Lawson arrived on Friday afternoon. Celine had purposely taken a half-day off. Staying at the office and pretending everything was fine was possible, but draining. She had spent the morning on autopilot opening spreadsheets, verifying figures, replying to emails. Her coworkers didn't suspect a thing. But by noon, she knew if she stayed in her cubicle until 5, she would shatter under the weight of her own silence. David was a stocky, unassuming man in his late 40s, wearing a light blue button-down shirt without a tie. He carried a leather folder under his arm and carried himself like a man who had absolutely nothing to prove. His results did the talking. He greeted them briefly, sat at the dining table, and got straight to the point. He opened the folder. Celine sat across from him and listened. Anthony Reynolds's chain of stores consisted of 4 locations on paper. An operating small business with cash flow. In reality, it was a hollow structure propped up not by actual revenue, but by a continuous shell game of covering one obligation with another. 2 major wholesale suppliers had severely overdue invoices, and negotiations for an extension were stalling. His business line of credit with the bank was virtually maxed out. What little remained was evaporating. The suburban warehouse he leased was on a favorable grandfathered rate that expired in 2 months, and the landlord had already signaled they would not renew under the old terms. Furthermore, David mentioned ongoing negotiations with an angel investor that Anthony had been courting for weeks. The investor hadn't committed yet. They were demanding more documents, dragging out the due diligence. Could it just be a rough patch? Celine asked. David shook his head. A rough patch is when you're temporarily illiquid, but you have a solid pipeline and financial reserves. This is different. The point is, there are no reserves here, no financial cushion, and no viable strategy to turn a profit. The business is surviving purely by attracting new funds to pay off old debts. That only works up to the exact moment one creditor refuses to wait. Then the entire house of cards collapses incredibly fast, and it's irreversible. Does he understand this himself? Robert asked. He has to, David replied. A guy running a business for years sees his own balance sheets. The question isn't whether he knows he's going under. The question is what he plans to do about it. And based on what Celine just told me, he looked at her, his expression entirely professional, devoid of unnecessary pity. He plans to plug the holes using his wife's assets. By making you a guarantor, pulling equity out of this condo, or taking a joint loan against your corporate salary. Likely a combination of all three. The room fell dead silent. Outside, the city hummed, the faint sound of sirens down Michigan Avenue music from an open window across the street. An ordinary, humid Chicago afternoon, entirely oblivious to the implosion happening inside the apartment. Celine looked down at the printouts and numbers scattered across the table. For the longest time, she had thought his pushiness regarding their finances was just his clumsy way of asking for help. She thought his pressure was born out of masculine pride and shame. Now these numbers laid bare what his words had so expertly concealed. There was no shame. There was only a strategy. Calculated, sequential, ruthless. Is the condo at risk? She asked. No, her father stated firmly. You didn't sign anything. The property is legally yours through a deed of gift before the marriage. It is separate property, not a marital asset. In a divorce proceeding, he cannot touch it unless he can prove commingling of funds, which he can't. Your position on the condo is ironclad. I'll double-check the nuances with an Illinois family attorney, David added, but Robert is right. You have nothing to fear on that front. What's next? Celine asked. Her father and David exchanged a brief look like two generals who had already finalized the battle plan. No sudden movements, Robert said. You act completely normal at home. Do not give him any indication that you saw him at O'Hare. Do not sign a single piece of paper under any pretext. Just keep doing exactly what you've been doing for the last few months and wait. Wait for what? Wait for his situation to reach critical mass, David answered evenly. It's going to happen in a matter of weeks, not much longer than that. We don't have to invent or fabricate anything. All we have to do is make sure the actual, unvarnished truth is seen by the people who have been turning a blind eye. His creditors, his suppliers, that potential angel investor. If they receive accurate, verifiable information about his risk profile, they will make their own decisions. Nobody is obligated to fund a sinking ship. Is that legal? Celine asked. Perfectly legal, her father said. No extortion, no blackmail, no dirty tricks. We are simply working with what already exists. His liabilities are real. We didn't create them. We are just going to stop helping him hide them. Celine fell silent. She looked at her father, this man who had flown in and in less than 48 hours diagnosed and dismantled the illusion she had spent years refusing to look at. Not because she was blind, but because she had chosen to believe in her husband. That's what happens when you share a life with someone. You actively resist thinking the worst of them. It wasn't stupidity. It was just the heavy price of misplaced trust. Okay, she finally said. I'll do exactly what you say. Her mother brought in a tray of coffee. She set the mugs down without making a fuss and sat next to her daughter. She didn't say a word. She was just there in that unconditional way only people who truly love you can be. It was getting dark outside. The city was transitioning into its usual evening rhythm. Headlights sweeping across the pavement, the glow of street lamps, the distant murmur of downtown. Nothing had changed out there. Inside Celine, however, something had finalized its structural shift. The pain wasn't gone. It sat beneath her ribs, dull and constant. But it was no longer the driving force. The driving force now was something entirely different. Cold, hyper-focused, resolute. It felt like readiness. Anthony came back on Saturday evening. He looked upbeat. He dropped his leather weekender bag by the door, projecting the aura of a man who had just crushed a grueling but highly successful round of negotiations. Celine met him in the foyer. Her parents had already left exactly as planned. They didn't need extra witnesses for the initial phase. Let the illusion of normalcy persist. "I missed you," Anthony said, pulling her into a hug. "You must be exhausted," Celine replied. She didn't pull away. She stood straight, allowing the embrace, surprised by how easy it was. She used to think that if she ever found out she was being betrayed, she wouldn't even be able to look at the person without trembling. But she could do it now because she was looking at him through a completely different lens. Not as a husband, but as a hostile entity she needed to observe closely until it was time to strike. It was a clinical, almost professional detachment, like staring at a complex discrepancy in a financial audit that needed to be resolved carefully, flawlessly, without a single error. During the first week after his return, Anthony was calm. He'd come home from his office, casually drop bits and pieces of business news like a man used to a wife who wasn't deeply involved. Celine listened. She noticed the pregnant pauses she had previously overlooked. She noticed how expertly he skirted around specific details whenever money was mentioned, just sorting some things out. "Cash flow is tight this quarter, but we're turning a corner," he'd say. It was the rhetoric of a man desperately buying time. Meanwhile, David Lawson was quietly going to work, methodical, silent. The first domino to wobble was one of the major suppliers, a massive wholesale distributor Anthony had worked with for 3 years. Through his vast network of Chicago business contacts, David subtly ensured the distributor's regional director heard whispers about the questionable solvency of Anthony's retail chain. He merely suggested they might want to pull an updated credit report before approving the NextNet 6.0 payment extension. The regional director was a pragmatic guy. He'd been in wholesale a long time and had seen plenty of shiny retail empires collapse overnight. He didn't need much convincing. A hint was enough. He demanded updated audited financials from Anthony. Anthony provided documents that looked okay on the surface, but under the newfound scrutiny, they revealed exactly what David had seen: gaping holes covered by short-term extensions. The supplier made a swift corporate decision. They revoked the extension and demanded a 50% upfront payment for the next shipment. For Anthony, this meant an immediate, crippling shortage of working capital at the absolute worst possible moment. The second domino was the warehouse landlord. David didn't call him directly. He just made a few inquiries through real estate brokers in the suburbs, and the information organically found its way to the owner. The landlord, a cautious commercial property manager, abruptly brought up the lease renewal a month early. He laid out the new terms, current market rate, no legacy discounts. Anthony tried to negotiate promising growth and stability, but without financial proof, his words rang hollow. Simultaneously, the angel investor Anthony had been courting for over a month, ordered an independent forensic audit of the business. It was standard due diligence for an investor, but now they were looking specifically for red flags. The audit revealed exactly what any unbiased professional would find: extreme over-leverage, catastrophic cash flow gaps, and an unsustainable reliance on debt cycling. The investor hit pause, and the pause dragged on. All of this didn't happen in a single day, or even a single week. Almost 3 weeks passed from the time Anthony returned from his trip before the pressure truly began to crush him. And that's when his conversations about money shifted. At first, it was subtle, almost casual. They were having dinner on a Wednesday night. Anthony was talking about supply chain issues. Then, as if it were an afterthought, he said, "You know, we've never really consolidated our assets as a couple. Maybe we should combine our efforts." "What do you mean?" Celine asked, not lifting her eyes from her plate. "Well, in business, you know how it goes. But we're family. We're in this together." "I have my own career," she said mildly. "I'm a corporate employee, Anthony, not an entrepreneur." Anthony nodded and dropped the subject for the night. But 3 days later, he circled back. This time, he was more specific. He mentioned a great opportunity to refinance a high-interest corporate loan, but the bank needed a co-signer with W-2 income to secure the lower rate. "It's purely a technicality," he explained smoothly. "Zero actual risk for you. Just a signature on the dotted line." "No," Celine answered just as calmly. "Like I've always said, I don't sign loan documents without independent legal counsel. That's my boundary." "You know what this is about, Celine. Why do we need lawyers?" "This is family business. Exactly why it needs a lawyer. Family business requires the most caution." He fell silent. He looked at her with an expression she had learned to read perfectly over the last month, deep irritation masked by a strained effort to keep his temper in check. He hadn't realized yet that she had changed. He thought she was just being her usual stubborn self, and he assumed his next tactic would break her down. He went for the condo, A week later, he launched into a long, patient, intensely persuasive pitch. He had found a bank offering a bridge loan program. If they used the condo's equity as collateral, he could secure a massive injection of cash. 6 months tops, he swore. I pay off the high-interest debt, the lien comes off the property. Everything's clean. He delivered this pitch one evening while they were sitting in the living room. He spoke with the measured cadence of an actor delivering a well-rehearsed monologue. Celine listened. She didn't interrupt. She let him finish every single sentence. The condo is not exposed to the risks of your business, she said, when he finally stopped. It's my separate property. I owned it before we got married, and it's going to stay mine regardless of what happens to your company. You're talking to me like you don't even know me, he said, a sharp edge of grievance bleeding into his voice. It was that specific, manipulative hurt designed to make the other person feel guilty. I'm talking to you as someone who actually reads the fine print before signing, she replied. Anthony stood up from the sofa and began pacing the living room. Celine didn't follow him with her eyes. She kept looking at the magazine in her lap. She could feel his glare burning into her, but she didn't lift her head. This, too, was a skill she had honed. Do not feed his reaction. Starve him of the conflict he's craving. While this silent, bloodless war raged inside the apartment, Celine called her parents a few times a week. How are you holding up? Her mother asked one evening. I'm managing, Celine replied. Is it hard? Yes, but not in the way I expected. She paused, searching for the right words. You know what the strangest part is? I don't even want to cry. I just want this to be over. I want things to be back in order. They will be, Sophia said gently. For 7 years, I convinced myself everything was normal, that he was just stressed, that business was tough, that we were just hitting bumps like any other couple. But the truth is, I just didn't want to ask myself the real questions because I was terrified of the real answers. It is never your fault that you chose to trust someone, her mother told her. Celine looked up at the ceiling. I know, but I'm never going to be afraid of the answers again. Her mother didn't add anything. She just agreed. Through all of this, Celine never gave Anthony a single clue that she knew about the airport. No subtle hints, no lingering glares, no sarcastic remarks. There were moments when she desperately wanted to scream it at him, especially when he was acting particularly arrogant or when he would step into the home office to take a hushed phone call, assuming she couldn't hear him. But every time the urge rose in her throat, she remembered her father's voice at O'Hare. A precise strike. No scandal. So, she held her tongue. Katrina Sanders, meanwhile, was also sensing a shift, though, of a very different nature. Anthony was calling her less frequently, and their clandestine meetups at upscale downtown hotels had dwindled. He kept promising her that things were about to be finalized, that everything was going to work out, that she just needed to be a little more patient. Katrina waited. She was young, highly attractive, and possessed a very simple metric for reading men. Does he have money, or doesn't he? Anthony used to have money, or rather, the convincing illusion of it. But the cracks in that illusion were becoming glaringly obvious. She noticed how irritable he was. She noticed he had stopped making grand, effortless promises about their future, the very confidence that had drawn her to him in the first place. Now his voice carried the distinct tone of a man begging for an extension. He wasn't begging her directly, but he was taking a little longer to reply to texts. Sometimes he didn't reply at all until the next day. Anthony noticed her pulling away, and it infuriated him, but his hands were tied. His trump cards were gone, and he had no new ones to play. Katrina wasn't in a rush to make a dramatic exit. She was used to waiting until the dust settled to see where she stood, but internally she had already made her decision. At the end of the 3rd week, David called Robert Cruz. The angel investor had officially backed out. No dramatic boardroom fights, no burned bridges, just a formal email. Based on our review of the financials, we do not feel it is prudent to proceed with an investment at this stage. Polite, final. For Anthony, it was a devastating blindside. The investor had been his life raft. That cash infusion was supposed to plug the most critical leaks and buy him time to maneuver. Without that money, the elaborate narrative he had constructed over the past few months, the negotiations, the promises, the delays, evaporated into thin air. Celine found out on a Thursday. Her father called and relayed the update. So, it's close, she asked. It's imminent, Robert confirmed. David says maybe a week and a half at most. When an investor walks away, it triggers a chain reaction. Word travels fast in the Chicago commercial sector. Everyone else gets spooked and rushes to collect what's theirs. It starts a collapse that he cannot stop from the inside. What does he have left? Debts, her father said bluntly, and a desperate need to find someone else to pay them. His last resort is going to be you, your condo, your salary. The conversation he's going to start in the next few days will be the most aggressive one yet. Be ready. I'm ready, Celine said, and hung up. Over the next few days, Anthony wandered around the apartment like a man with a shattered rib in immense pain, but unable to decide if he should admit he was injured. Celine observed him with the icy detachment she had perfected. He completely stopped talking about his business. In the past, even on bad days, he could always spin a positive narrative, inventing some convoluted reason why a massive payout was just around the corner. Now there was just silence. And that silence was louder than a siren. By Monday, he didn't even go into the office until noon. He sat at the kitchen island, staring at his phone. Scrolling, typing, a frantic message, deleting it, scrolling again. The useless, twitchy finger movements of a man frantically searching for an exit door that doesn't exist. Celine was leaving for work at 8:00 a.m. She looked at him as she poured her coffee into a travel mug and buttoned her trench coat. Anthony looked up at her. "Are you working late tonight?" he asked. "I don't know," she replied. "Depends on the workload." He nodded and dropped his eyes back to the screen. On Wednesday, David texted Celine. Just a brief update. The bank had officially informed Anthony that they were not renewing his business line of credit. This wasn't just a blow. This was the kill shot. Without a line of credit, there was no working capital. Without working capital, there was no inventory. Without inventory, there was no revenue to cover his already suffocating overhead. Celine read the text at her desk in her downtown office. She placed the phone face down and went back to the quarterly report she was auditing. She finished one page, then another. Then she stood up, walked to the break room, poured herself a glass of water, and stood by the window for a full minute. She looked down at the Chicago streets. Cars, pedestrians, food carts. A perfectly ordinary afternoon in the city. Nothing special. That evening, Anthony came home truly broken for the first time. He walked in silently. He tossed his keys onto the entryway console, missed, and they clattered to the hardwood floor. He didn't pick them up. He walked straight into the living room, bypassed Celine entirely, and collapsed onto the sofa. He didn't take off his suit jacket. He just sat there, head bowed, staring at the rug. Celine stood in the kitchen doorway watching him, waiting. At 37, Anthony Reynolds was accustomed to projecting a very specific version of himself to the world, the guy in control. The guy who always had a backup plan, a slick pivot, a bulletproof argument. That image had provided him with his most prized possession, the feeling of always being one step ahead of everyone else. Now looking at him, Celine saw a man who had run out of steps, no pivots left. Just a mountain of debt and an overdrawn bank account. "What happened?" "The bank," she asked, not raising her voice. "Pulled the line of credit completely." "I understand, Celine," said her voice perfectly flat. Anthony snapped his head up. Something in her tone ignited a spark in him. It was too calm, too level. Utterly devoid of pity. "You understand," he repeated. "That's all you have to say. What do you want me to say?" He stood up. He started pacing the room, his movements erratic, frantic. Like a man who needed to throw a punch just to keep his own skin from tearing apart. "Celine, I need your help, for real this time. Look at me. We have to leverage the condo. 6 months. I pull the cash out. I pay off the most aggressive creditors. I negotiate new terms with the suppliers. I find a new backer. I just need a runway." "No," Celine said. "You're not even thinking about it." "I've been thinking about it for a long time. The answer is no." Anthony stopped dead in front of her. He stared at her for a long time as if he were looking at a stranger wearing his wife's face. "So you're just gonna let me drown?" "No. I'm just refusing to lash myself to your sinking ship. Those are two different things. You're my wife. Which is exactly why I'm not a guarantor for your corporate debts." She turned around and walked back toward the kitchen. He followed her. Celine stood calmly by the marble island, unmoving. She could feel the heat radiating off him, the sheer palpable fury, and she offered him absolutely nothing in return. That perhaps was the most devastating tactic of all, the absolute refusal to engage. The refusal to play the role of the hysterical, emotionally invested spouse. "I need capital," he finally snarled. The mask was entirely off. The charming persuasion was gone. It was just a brutal demand slapped onto the counter. "You work. You have excellent credit and a high salary. Take out a personal loan." "No. They'll approve you for a massive amount." "No, Anthony. This is our family," he yelled, his voice cracking like a whip. For the first time in the entire conversation, he lost his temper completely. "You can't just stand there and watch everything I've built collapse. I didn't build it," Celine said softly. "And it isn't collapsing today. And it isn't because of the bank." He froze. He looked at her with the panicked expression of a man realizing the ground he's standing on is actually a trapdoor. But it was too late. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" he asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "It means your business has been fundamentally broken for a lot longer than the last few months," she answered, her voice cold and steady. "And you know that better than I do." Anthony didn't reply. He walked slowly back to the sofa and sat down. The manic, aggressive energy that had fueled him seconds ago completely vanished. He looked deflated. He sat in silence for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice lacked any trace of anger. It sounded almost casual, entitled, "Fine, let it all burn. Doesn't matter. We'll just live off your savings and sell your jewelry. Your parents bought you enough diamonds over the years. You're my wife. You're obligated to support your husband when things get tough. What's the code to the safe again?" Celine stood entirely still, staring at him. She hadn't known exactly what she expected to hear, but it certainly wasn't that. It wasn't the grotesque, simplistic distillation of what she actually meant to him after 7 years. Not a partner. Not the love of his life. An insurance policy. A fallback option. A line item on a spreadsheet to be liquidated in case of emergency. She had thought hearing it would shatter her. She thought it would trigger a tidal wave of grief she couldn't contain. But there was no grief. There was no wave. There was only the blinding, crystal-clear realization that comes when the final question is finally answered. For 7 years, she had convinced herself she was married to a man who was just tired, just stressed, just carrying too much weight. Now, she saw him exactly as he was. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore because he didn't think he needed to. The last fragile tether connecting her to the past snapped and dissolved into nothingness. No pain, no bitterness. "Okay," she said. "I hear you." She walked into the kitchen, pulled the door shut behind her, and stood by the sink for a few minutes. She looked out the window. It was fully dark now. The street lamps down below flickered to life. Across the street, an older woman sat on a bench, while her golden retriever sniffed the pavement. An incredibly ordinary scene. Celine pulled her phone from her pocket and texted her father. "It's time." The reply came less than a minute later. "Understood. David and I will handle it." She barely slept that night. Not from anxiety, but from the strange, almost physical adrenaline of total clarity. Her thoughts were sharp, concise, and tactical. What needs to be done? In what order? How exactly? The next morning, Thursday, she met David Lawson at a quiet cafe near a boutique hotel in the Loop. She recounted the argument from the night before, calmly omitting unnecessary emotional details. When she repeated Anthony's demand to sell her jewelry to fund his life, David didn't say a word. He just slightly raised his eyebrows for a fraction of a second, the look of a professional having his worst assumptions validated. David got straight to business. His situation as of this morning is terminal. The bank pulled the credit line. His primary distributor is demanding upfront cash he doesn't have. The warehouse landlord served him notice for the rent hike. He either pays the premium, or he has to vacate and find a new warehouse, which requires a massive deposit and logistics capital he also doesn't have. By my projections, he has 2, maybe 3 weeks before the actual lawsuits start hitting from creditors. Once that begins, the bankruptcy snowball is unstoppable. Unless someone steps in and bails him out, Celine stated. Exactly, David confirmed. But he's burned his bridges. His business contacts know he's radioactive right now. Nobody is lending him a dime without collateral. He is backed into a permanent corner. Celine looked out the cafe window at the bustling Chicago street. Her face was entirely neutral. No triumph, no pride, just observation. "I need a divorce attorney," she said. "The best one you know for high-asset contentious splits." "I have someone," David said instantly. "A bulldog. She can see you tomorrow at 11:00 a.m. if that works for you." It works. The lawyer was a sharp, impeccably dressed woman in her early 40s who spoke in bullet points. She saw Celine in a sleek office overlooking the Chicago River. She listened intently, didn't interrupt, and only asked highly specific, probing questions. Professional, clinical. She reviewed the deed to the condo, the trust documents from Celine's parents, and the tax returns. After 20 minutes, she delivered the conclusion Celine already knew, but needed to hear on official legal letterhead. The condo is your separate non-marital property. It was gifted to you before the marriage and title was never commingled. It is entirely immune to equitable distribution in an Illinois divorce. There is zero risk. Furthermore, you haven't signed a single corporate guarantee for his business, not one Celine confirmed. The lawyer nodded and outlined the next steps. We draft the petition for dissolution of marriage. We file it. We serve him. Because the residence is your sole property, we can petition for exclusive possession of the marital home if he refuses to leave voluntarily. It's standard procedure. Very clean. Celine took notes in her planner, marveling at how surreal the legal terminology sounded. Dissolution of marriage, equitable distribution, exclusive possession. 7 years of a life that felt or had at least appeared real ultimately boiled down to a stack of standardized forms, dates, signatures, and notary stamps. It wasn't a tragedy. It was just a fact she was finally looking at without flinching. "Call me when you're ready to pull the trigger," the lawyer said as they shook hands. "I can have the filings ready in 48 hours. On Friday night, Anthony tried again. This time there was no anger, no bullying. He spoke softly. He was practically begging. He said he had found a private hard money lender. No banks involved, no real estate collateral required, just a personal guarantor signature. "No," Celine said. "Celine, I am begging you. No." He fell completely silent. He stood up and walked into the spare bedroom. Half an hour later, Celine heard him talking on the phone. Hushed, frantic, desperate whispers. Then, dead silence. During those days, Katrina Sanders had stopped answering Anthony's calls on the first ring. Sometimes she didn't call back at all. Anthony noticed, but he couldn't confront her about it because he had no leverage. Their last conversation had been brief. She told him she was tired of waiting, that the sneaking around wasn't working for her anymore, and that she needed security. Anthony had promised her security using the exact same hollow phrases he had used a dozen times before. Katrina had simply said, "Okay," in the tone of a woman who knows absolutely nothing is going to be okay. She never called him again. Saturday passed in heavy, suffocating silence. Anthony spent the entire day in the apartment, pacing, staring at his phone, picking at his food. Twice, he walked out onto the balcony and just stood there, staring down at the city streets with the blank, hollow eyes of a man who had run out of lies to tell himself. Celine worked on her laptop in the bedroom, only coming out to go to the kitchen. They barely exchanged a word. This silence was different from the usual weekend quiet. It wasn't the silence of exhaustion or unspoken tension. It was the absolute terminal silence that descends when two people know it's over, but neither has said the words out loud yet. Celine thought about how, in just a few days, this condo would be solely hers again. She would come home and it would be quiet, but a different kind of quiet. Not the anxious silence of waiting for a bomb to go off, but the peaceful silence of a space that belongs entirely to you. She didn't want anything more than that. Right now, it was enough just to reach the end of the road that had started at O'Hare 5 weeks ago. On Monday evening, Celine called the attorney and told her to finalize the paperwork. Her voice was steady, void of hesitation. The voice of a woman who had made her choice weeks ago and was simply executing the final phase. By 1:00 a.m. tomorrow, everything will be ready, the lawyer replied. Celine thanked her, hung up, and sat in the quiet of her bedroom, staring at the closed door. Beyond that door was the living room. Anthony was sitting out there. She could hear him aimlessly flipping through TV channels, pausing, flipping again. He wasn't watching anything. He was just trying to fill the silence with noise. She had learned to notice that too. Tuesday morning, she woke up early. She brewed coffee and drank it standing by the window, watching the city wake up below. Anthony was still asleep. She dressed in her sharpest blazer, grabbed her leather tote, and walked out the door just like any other Tuesday. Nothing special. At 1:00 a.m., she sat in her lawyer's office and received the folder, a filed copy of the petition for dissolution of marriage, the deed to the condo, the trust documents, everything neatly tabbed and organized. Signed, sealed, and stamped. The lawyer had filed the original with the Cook County clerk that very morning. Celine held the heavy manila folder and looked at it, thinking again how strange it was that 7 years could fit into a half-inch stack of paper. From the lawyer's office, Celine went straight to the hotel where her parents were staying. They had flown back into Chicago the night before to be there for the final act. Robert opened the hotel room door before she even knocked, as if he'd been standing right behind it. Sophia was sitting by the window with a cup of tea. She looked up, her eyes full of that deep, quiet, maternal fierce. Celine walked in and took off her coat. She sat on the edge of the armchair. The room smelled of fresh coffee and the Chicago Tribune. Her dad always bought a physical newspaper when he traveled. Old habits from his City Hall days, he preferred starting his morning with ink on his fingers rather than a glowing screen. Some things about a person never change, Celine thought, and that's a comfort. They hugged. Tonight, Celine said simply. Her father nodded. "I'll be right there with you. In the room, but out of the way. I won't interfere unless I have to." "You won't have to," Celine replied. "I can handle him." "I know you can," Robert said. "Which is exactly why I'll just be standing there." Her mother stood up, walked over, and wrapped her arms around her daughter. It was the kind of hug you give someone before they walk into a storm. Tight, fortifying no unnecessary drama. Celine squeezed back for a second, then let go. "Are you ready?" Sophia asked softly. "I'm ready." And it was the absolute truth. Celine went back to the office and worked through the afternoon with total, laser-focused calm. She knocked out 3 pending reports, replied to a dozen emails, grabbed a matcha latte with a coworker at 3:00 p.m., and chatted about office politics as if her entire life wasn't about to detonate in a few hours. Nobody noticed a thing. She was a master at not showing her hand. At 5:30 p.m., she logged off, walked to her car, and drove to the hotel to pick up her father. They drove back to the condo in silence. Robert looked out the passenger window at the rush-hour gridlock. Celine drove with practiced ease, running over the words in her head. Keep it simple. No dramatic speeches. Just the facts. Anthony was standing in the kitchen staring at his phone when she unlocked the front door. He looked up and then he saw Robert stepping in behind her. Something in Anthony's face shifted immediately. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the hypervigilance of a cornered hustler, realizing that when your father-in-law shows up unannounced, the game is up. Robert, Anthony said, trying to force a tone of casual surprise. "I didn't know you were in town." "I've been in town," her father replied smoothly. He didn't offer a handshake. He walked past Anthony into the living room and sat down in the armchair by the window, completely relaxed, like a man who had all the time in the world. Celine remained standing in the kitchen directly across the island from Anthony. "We need to talk," she said. "I'm listening," he replied, though the swagger had completely bled out of his voice. He shifted his weight nervously. "I know about O'Hare," Celine said. "I was there, 5 weeks ago. I saw you and the blonde woman arriving together." Anthony didn't answer immediately. He froze for a fraction of a second, his eyes darting, as his brain desperately tried to cycle through his options. Deny. Explain. Attack. He went with the first. "She's a colleague. It was a business trip. We just happened to be on the same flight." "You kissed her on the mouth in the arrivals hall," Celine stated. "You carried her bag. You got into an Uber together." Silence. "My parents were standing right next to me," Celine added. No anger, no bitterness, just laying out the evidence. "They saw everything I saw. So let's skip the business trip narrative." Anthony slowly set his phone down on the marble counter. He looked at her, the desperate wheels in his head finally grinding to a halt. There was no spinning this. He just stared. "I know her name is Katrina Sanders," Celine continued. "She worked retail at your North Side location. And I know it's been going on for a lot longer than a month." More silence. "I also know about your business," she said. Her voice didn't waver. "I know about the wholesale suppliers cutting you off. I know about the bank pulling your line of credit. I know the angel investor walked away. I know exactly how deep in the red you are, and I know exactly what you were trying to do to me. For the last 5 weeks, the sudden interest in our family finances, the push to leverage the condo, asking me to co-sign a loan, demanding I sell my jewelry." "Celine," he interrupted, his voice tight. "I'm not finished," she cut him off, slicing through his protest with surgical precision. "I filed a petition for dissolution of marriage this morning. The court has the paperwork. This condo is my sole separate property. I owned it before I met you, and the deed was never commingled. You know that. I am asking you to pack your things and leave this apartment within the next hour." Anthony stared at her. The shock was fading rapidly, replaced by a vicious cold fury, the rage of a narcissist realizing he has been outplayed. "You planned this," he hissed. "You think I don't see what's been happening the last few weeks?" His voice grew louder, nastier. "The suppliers, the warehouse landlord, the investor pulling out. None of that was a coincidence. Your father used his old Chicago connections to sabotage me." "Prove it," Robert said from the armchair in the living room. It was spoken quietly without a hint of challenge. An invitation. Anthony whipped his head around to glare at the older man. He stared at Robert for a long time, his jaw clenched so hard a muscle twitched in his cheek. But he turned back around because there was absolutely nothing he could prove. The creditors had made their own independent decisions based on real data. The investor had run their own audit. The landlord had calculated their own risk. No one had done anything illegal. The financial world had simply woken up to the reality Anthony had been hiding. "Did you hear me?" Celine repeated. "If you don't leave voluntarily right now, I will have my attorney file an emergency motion for exclusive possession of the property, and the sheriff will escort you out. I have the legal right to do so." Anthony stood frozen in the kitchen. For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. Then he snatched his keys off the counter and stormed into the bedroom. He slammed the door, not violently, but loud enough to make a point. Celine stood in the middle of the kitchen, listening to his heavy footsteps on the hardwood floors. Then silence. Her father stood up from the armchair and walked over to her. He didn't hug her. He didn't offer any grand words of wisdom. He just stood shoulder to shoulder with her. And that was exactly enough. It took Anthony an hour to pack. He moved through the apartment in angry, erratic bursts. He shoved clothes into a large canvas duffel bag, grabbed files from his desk in the home office, threw his chargers and razors from the bathroom into a dop kit. Celine sat on the living room sofa, reading a magazine, or at least pretending to. Her father remained in the armchair wearing the relaxed expression of a man waiting for a delayed flight. Neither of them interfered. Neither offered a sarcastic comment. They were two people who fundamentally understood that when an enemy is retreating, you let them pack in peace. Celine listened to the familiar sounds, the opening and closing of closet doors, the snap of a briefcase latch, the rustle of plastic dry cleaning bags. Ordinary, everyday household noises she had heard for 7 years. Now they carried the weight of finality. Endings are rarely cinematic. They just happen. When Anthony finally hauled his bags to the front door, he stopped with his hand on the knob. He turned and looked at Celine. "You think you won," he spat. "I think I protected what belongs to me," she replied evenly. "This isn't a victory, it's just the result." He opened the door and walked out. The heavy door clicked shut behind him. Celine slowly lowered the magazine she hadn't been reading. She sat in the absolute silence of her living room for a long time. Her father didn't push her to speak. 20 minutes later, the lock clicked. Her mother let herself in using the spare key Celine had given her earlier. Sophia walked into the kitchen, put a kettle on the stove for tea, and came out to sit next to her daughter on the sofa. The three of them drank tea as the sun dipped below the Chicago skyline. It was that specific time of evening when the city transitions from the frantic energy of the workday into the electric glow of the night. For a few minutes, everything hangs in a golden, suspended stillness that's hard to describe, but universally understood. Nobody talked about anything serious. Her father asked if they had any decent bread in the house. Her mother went to the fridge to check for sandwich meat. Celine looked out the floor-to-ceiling window, marveling at how bizarre the mechanics of life truly are. The most devastating monumental chapter of her adult life had just ended, and it concluded with tea silence and a question about bread. There were no trumpets, no dramatic movie monologues. You just keep living. You're just a little different now. A little more honest and infinitely more free. Over the next few weeks, everything played out exactly as David had predicted. Anthony's creditors, realizing there was no hidden cash reserve or wealthy wife to bail him out, went on the offensive. A vendor filed a lawsuit for breach of contract. Another halted all shipments until arrears were paid. 2 of the 4 retail locations shut down within a month. The inventory dried up. He couldn't pay the suburban warehouse rent, so he was evicted. Forced to rent a cheap U-Haul to move whatever stock he had left to a discount liquidator, desperately trying to sell it for pennies on the dollar. Katrina quit her job at his store. 2 weeks later, Anthony's last operating branch closed its doors permanently. By that time, Katrina had completely ghosted him. She had already updated her profile picture on Instagram. She was standing on a boat in Lake Michigan, her arm wrapped around a different, older, sharply dressed man. It was perfectly clear, requiring no further explanation. She wasn't the type to explain herself anyway. Why bother when the results speak for themselves? Anthony texted Celine a few times during the fallout. First, he tried to negotiate. Then he sent long, rambling paragraphs full of blame and venom. Finally, he went silent. Celine's replies were strictly handled through her attorney, limited entirely to the logistics of the divorce court dates, financial disclosures, signed waivers, nothing extra. The divorce went through without a trial. During the final hearing via Zoom, the judge asked the standard questions. Both agreed the marriage was irretrievably broken. The condo was legally confirmed as Celine's separate property. Since Anthony's business was a liability rather than an asset, there was nothing to divide there. The entirety of their 7-year marital estate amounted to Celine keeping the living room furniture and Anthony keeping his leased BMW. That was it. Walking out of the Daly Center courthouse in downtown Chicago, Celine stopped on the concrete steps. Her mother and father stood beside her, giving her a few feet of space, letting her breathe. The crisp autumn sun was shining. It wasn't hot, but it was incredibly bright, the kind of piercing, clear light that cuts through the wind off Lake Michigan and feels entirely honest. Celine tilted her face up toward it for a second. She felt the warmth, light, but undeniable. She realized that this was the beginning of something entirely new. It wasn't a sudden explosion of joy or overwhelming relief. It was simply the first day that her life belonged solely to her again. She turned to her parents. "It's done," she said. It's done, Sophia confirmed, reaching out to squeeze her hand. Her father didn't say anything. He just stepped up to walk beside her. Calm, steady, unshakable. Just like he had been that evening at O'Hare when he put his hand on her shoulder and said, "Let us teach him a lesson." He hadn't been acting out of vengeance. He had simply removed a parasite's ability to survive by feeding on his daughter's trust. It wasn't a punishment. It was protection. A subtle distinction, but it meant everything. Celine Reynolds walked down the courthouse steps, flanked by her father and mother. She wasn't thinking about the past 7 years anymore. She was thinking about what tonight would be like in her apartment. Quiet hers, completely devoid of someone else's tension and lies. Just the evening, just the quiet, just her own life, which finally belonged to no one but herself.